Morning, everybody. Got the frogs in the background this morning. It rained a good bit here last night. Today we're going to start on chapter 17. He turned back to his campsite and looked at the wreckage. He had a lot to do. Rebuild his shelter, get a new fire going, get some food, or get ready to find some food, make weapons, and he had to work slowly because his ribs hurt. First things first, he tried to find some dry grass and twigs, then peeled the bark from the nearby birch and shredded it into a fire nest. He worked slowly, but even so, with the new skill, he had a fire going in less than an hour. The flames cut the cool, damp morning, crackled, and did much to bring his spirits up, not to mention chasing away the incessant mosquitoes. With the fire going, he searched for the dry wood. The rain had driven water down into virtually all the wood he could find, and at last he located a thick evergreen where the top branches had covered the lower dead ones, keeping them dry. He had great difficulty breaking them, not being able to pull much with his arms or chest muscles, but finally got enough to keep the fire going all day and into the night. When he rested a bit, eased his chest, and then sat about getting the shelter squared away. Much of the wood was from his original wall was still nearby, and up in the back of the ridge, he actually found a major section of the weave still intact. The wind had torn it out, lifted it, and thrown it into the top of the ridge, and Brian felt lucky once more that he had not been killed or more seriously injured. With what would have been the same, he thought. If he couldn't hunt, he would die. If he were injured badly, he would not be able to hunt. He jerked and dragged wood around until the wall was once more in place, crudely. But he could improve it later. He had no trouble finding enough pine boughs to make a new bed. The storm had torn the forest into pieces, up in the back of the ridge, and it looked like a giant had become angry and used some kind of a massive meat grinder on the trees. Huge pines were twisted and snapped off, blown sideways. The ground was so littered, with limbs and treetops sticking every which way, that it was hard to get through. He pulled enough thick limbs in for the bed, green and spicy with the new broken sap smell. By the evening, he was exhausted, hungry, and hurting, but he had to do something. He had something close to place to live again, a place to be. Gonna let this dog out real quick. They don't like being apart from each other. Tomorrow, he thought, as he lay back in the darkness, tomorrow maybe the fish would be back, and he would make a spear and a new bow and get some food. Tomorrow he would find food and refine the camp and bring things back to sanity from the once completely insane day. He faced the fire, curving his body. He rested his head on his arm and began to sleep when a picture came to his head. The tail of the plane sticking out of the water. There it was, the tail sticking up. And the inside the plane, near the tail somewhere, was the survival pack. It must have survived the crash because the plane's main body was still intact. That was the picture. The tail sticking up and the survival pack inside. Right there, in his mind, as he dozed. His eyes snapped open. If I could get at the pack, he thought. Oh, if I could get at the pack. It probably had food and knives and matches. It might have a sleeping bag. It might have fishing gear. Oh, it must have so many wonderful things. If I could get at the pack and just get some of those things, I would be rich. So rich if I could get at the pack. Tomorrow. He watched the flames and smiled. Tomorrow I'll see. All things come tomorrow. He slept, deep and down, with only the picture of the plane tail sticking up in his mind. A healing sleep. In the morning, he rolled out before true light. In the gray dawn, he built up a fire and found more wood for the day, feeling almost chipper because his ribs were much better now. With the camp ready for the day, he looked to the lake. Part of him half expected the plain tail to be gone, sunk back into the depths, but he saw it was still there. It didn't seem to have moved at all. He looked down at his feet and saw that there were some fish in the fish pen, looking for tiny bits of bait still left from before the wind came. He fought the impatience to get on the plane project and remembered sense. Remembered what he had learned. First, food, because food made strength. First, food. Then, he thought, then action. There were fish at hand here, and he may not be able to get anything from the plane. That was all a dream. The fish were real, and his stomach, even the new shrunken stomach, was sending signals that it was savagely empty. He made a fish spear with 2 points, not peeling the bark all the way back, but working on the pointed end. It took him an hour or so, and in the time he worked, he sat looking at the tail of the plane sticking up into the air. His hands working on the spear, his mind working on the problem of the plane. When the spear was done, although still crude, he jammed a wedge between the points to spread them apart and went to the fish pond. There were not clouds of fish, but at least 10, and he picked one of the larger ones, a round fish, almost 6 inches long. Put the spear point on the water and held it, then thrust with a flicking motion of the wrist when the fish was just above the point. The fish was pinned neatly, and he took 2 more with the same ease, then carried all 3 back up to the fire. He had a fish board now, a piece of wood he had flattened with the hatchet that leaned up by the fire for cooking fish, so he didn't have to hold a stick all the time. Sorry, the dogs are doing something inside. He put the 3 fish on the board, pushed sharpened pegs through their tails to the cracks in the cooking board, and propped it next to the reddest part of the coals. In moments, the fish were hissing and cooking in the heat, and soon they were done. Or when he could stand the smell no longer, he picked the steaming meat from under the loosened skin and ate it. The fish did not fill him, did not come even close. Fish meat was too light for that, but they gave him strength. He could feel it moving to his arms and legs, and he could begin to work on the plane project. While making the spear, he had decided that what he would do was make a raft and push paddle the raft to the plane and tie it there for a working base. Somehow he would have to get into the tail, inside the plane, rip or cut his way in, and however he did it, he would need an operating base of some kind, a raft, which he found, ruefully, was much easier said than done. There were plenty of logs around. The shore was littered with driftwood, new and old, tossed up, scattered by the storm, and it was simple. It was a simple matter of finding 4 of them of the same length and pull them together. Keeping them together was the problem. Without rope or cross pieces and nails, the logs just rolled and separated. He tried wedging them together, crossing them over each other. Nothing seemed to work, and he needed a stable platform to get the job done. It was becoming frustrating, and he had a momentary loss of temper, as he would have done in the past when he was the other person. At that point, he sat back on the beach and studied the problem again. Sense. He had to use his sense. That is all it took to solve problems. Just sense. It came then. The logs that he selected were smooth and round and had no limbs. What he needed were logs with limbs sticking out. Then he could cross the limbs of one log over the limbs of the other and weave them together as he had done with his wall, the food cover shelf, and the fish gate. He scanned the area above the beach and found 4 dry treetops that had been broken off by the storm. These had limbs, and he dragged them down to his work area at the water's edge and fitted them together. It took most of the day. The limbs were cluttered and stuck any which way, and he would have to cut one to make another fit, and then cut one from another log and come back to the first one, and still another one from the third log would have to be pulled in. But at last, in the late afternoon, he was done, and the raft, which he called Brush Pile 1 for its looks, hung together even as he pulled it to the water off the beach. It floated well, if low in the water, and in the excitement, he started for the plane. He could not stand on it, but he would have to swim alongside. He was out to chest depth, and he realized he had no way to keep the raft at the plane. He needed some way to tie it to the place so he could work from it. And for a moment, he was stymied. He had no rope, and only a bowstring, and the other cut shoestring in his tennis shoes, which were by now looking close to dead, his toes showing at the tops. Then he remembered his windbreaker, and he found the tattered part he used for an arrow pouch. He tore it into narrow strips and tied them together to make a rope or a tie-down about 4 feet long. It wasn't strong. He couldn't use it to pull a Tarzan and swing from a tree, but he could hold a raft in place. Once more he slid the raft off the beach and out into the water until he was chest deep. He had left his tennis shoes in the water, and when he felt the sand turn to mud between his toes, he kicked off the bottom and began to swim. Pushing the raft, he figured, was about like trying to push an aircraft carrier. All the branches that stuck down into the water dragged and pulled, and the logs themselves fought any forward motion, and he hadn't gone 20 feet when he realized that it was going to be much harder than he thought to get the raft to the plane. It barely moved, and if he kept going on this way, he would just about reach the plane at dark. He decided to turn back again, spend the night, and start early in the morning, and he pulled the raft once more to the sand and wiped it dry with his hand. Patience. He was better now, but impatience still grounded him a bit, so he sat at the edge of the fish pond with his new spear and took 3 more fish, cooked them up, and ate them, which helped to pass the time until dark. He also dragged in more wood, endless wood, and then relaxed and watched the sunset over the trees in the back of the ridge. West, he thought. I'm watching the sunset in the west. And that way is north, where Father was. And that way is east, and that way south. And somewhere to the south and east, his mother would be. The news would be on television. He could visualize more easily his mother doing things than his father, because he had never been there where his father had lived now. He knew everything about where his mother lived, how his mother lived. She would have the small television on the kitchen counter on and be watching the news and talking about how awful it was in South Africa or how cute the baby on the commercial looked, talking and making sounds, cooking sounds. He jerked his mind back to the lake. There was great beauty here, almost unbelievable beauty. The sun exploded the sky, just blew it up with setting color. And the color that came down on the water of the lake lit the trees. Amazing beauty. And he wished he could share it with somebody and say, look there, and over there, and see that? But even alone, it was still beautiful, and he fed the fire to cut the night chill. There it is again, he thought. That late summer chill to the air. The smell of fall. He went to sleep thinking kind of a reverse question. He did not know if he would ever get out of this. Could not see how it might be. But if he did somehow get home and get back to living the way he had lived, would it just be the opposite? Would he be sitting watching television and suddenly think about the sunset on the back ridge and wonder how the color looked on the lake? Sleep. In the morning, the chill was more pronounced, and he could see tiny wisps of vapor from his breath. He threw wood on the fire and blew until it flamed, then banked the flames to last and went down to the lake. Perhaps because the air was so cool, the water felt warm as he waded in it. He made sure the hatchet was still at his belt and the raft still held together, then set out to pushing the raft and kicked swimming towards the tail of the plane. As before, it was a very hard going. Once an eddy of breeze came up against him, and he seemed to be standing still. And by the time he was close enough to the tail to see the rivets of the aluminum, he had pushed and kicked for over 2 hours and was nearly exhausted, and wished he had taken some time to get a fish or two and have breakfast. He was also as wrinkled as a prune and ready for the break. The tail looked much larger when he got next to it, with the major part of the vertical stabilizer showing and perhaps half of the elevators. Only a short piece of the top of the fuselage, the plane's body, towards the tail, was out of the water. Just a curve of aluminum, and at first he could see no place to tie the raft, but he pulled himself along the elevators to the end, and there he found a gap that went in up by the hinges where he could feed the rope through. With the raft secured, he climbed on the top and lay on his back for 15 minutes, resting and letting the sun warm him. The job, he thought, looked impossible. To have any chance of success, he would have to be strong when he started. Somehow, he had to get inside the plane. All the openings, even the small rear cargo hatch, were underwater, so he couldn't get at them without diving and coming up inside the plane, where he would be trapped. He shuddered at the thought, and then he remembered what was in front of the plane. Down in the bottom of the lake, still trapped in the seat, the body of the pilot. Sitting there in the water, Brian could see him, the big man with his hair waving in the current, his eyes open. Stop, he thought. Stop now. Stop that thinking. He was nearly at the point of swimming back to the shore and forgetting the whole thing, but the image of the survival pack kept him. If he could get it out of the plane, or if he could just get it and pull something out, a candy bar. Even that, just a candy bar, it would be worth it. But how to get inside of the plane? He rolled himself off the raft and pulled himself around the plane. No openings. 3 times he put his face in the water and opened his eyes and looked down. The water was murky, but he could see perhaps 6 feet, and there was no obvious way to get into the plane. He was blocked. Alrighty, it's the end of chapter 17. Got 2 more chapters, and then we'll start on the river most likely, which is the next book in the series. Hope everybody has a great day. Today is Thursday. One more day, and then so all day today, tomorrow, and then the weekend. Hope everybody's having a good day. See y'all.